Hello and welcome to the fifth of 8 lectures in the series Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This series is produced by Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, in cooperation with Third Age Learning, KW. These lectures were presented at Rim Park in Waterloo between January 9th and February 27th, 2020. This lecture, When Doing the Right Thing Doesn't Make You Right, Martin Luther's Very Public Ethics, is delivered by Reverend Dr. David Pfrimmer, Professor Emeritus at Martin Luther University College and a Fellow at the school's Center for Public Ethics.
Well, thank you. It is nice to be here. It's a little different vantage point when you're standing at the front. Most of us, many of us I should say, have a rather complicated relationship with Martin Luther, and I'm no exception to that. About 10 years ago, I was a participant at the Lutheran World Federation Assembly. And at that assembly, the German churches invited those who were participants from around the world to come to Wittenberg to visit Luther's sites, his home, and get an experience before they went on to the assembly. So I went to Wittenberg, and every night, for 3 nights, we had dinner with Martin and Katie Luther at their home. This is their home. It's now a museum. It's one of the largest Reformation museums in the world, but it was the Augustinian monastery where the Luthers lived. And the gentleman in the center is an actor named Bernard Naumann, and he played the role of Luther. He did an excellent job. He's the caretaker of the town church, which is kind of interesting. The manager, I should say, is probably a more accurate translation. And at the end of the 3 evenings, I went up to him and I just wanted to compliment him. He could perform 75% of Luther's table talk. Now, any of you know how much Luther's written and seen this. It's a fairly voluminous amount of material. And he was excellent in terms of his presentation. So I went up to him and I said to him I was very grateful for, I'd learned some things about Luther I hadn't. I really appreciated the chance and what he did. And he just stood there, and of course he doesn't go out of his persona, right? So he just looks at me and he goes, "Ah, my first fan." I've used that a lot with some of the people who question my Lutheran identity in some respects. But it doesn't end there. So 2 days later, we were in Stuttgart for the LWF assembly, and they had the opening session in which the German churches introduced themselves to the delegates from around the world. And so there on the stage is the very same Martin Luther, welcoming people to Germany. Did an excellent job. He was fantastic. And as it ended, I was coming down the escalator I was in the kind of cheap seats up top. I was coming down the escalator, and I looked down, and coming out of the hall is Martin Luther, surrounded by all the religious leaders and luminaries and dignitaries walking out. And he stops, and he walks right over to the escalator and gives me this big hug. And as I'm looking over his shoulder, I see all these leaders and folks looking back and sort of asking that proverbial question, who's the guy with Luther? Well, full disclosure, I'm that guy. And I'm a fan, but I'm also, like many of you, a serious critic of Luther, and I think it's important to bear that in mind. Let me see if I get this right. To understand Luther, from my perspective, one has to have a full appreciation of the importance of paradox. To understand Luther, paradox is kind of essential because there's a lot of paradoxical parts of Luther's life, but also his theology as someone, as I think as Alan shared with you and as Robert Kelly did a few weeks ago, pointed out the kind of dilemmas he poses between things that seem on the one hand this and on the other hand that, and interact with one another to expose and reveal certain insights and truth. Luther in 1967 was Time magazine's Man of the Year, I think they called it at that time, and they had in the editorial of that issue, they said that Luther looms so large that almost every age has been able to find in him a religious hero to its own liking. And I think that's true. In fact, this morning, looking at the paper, my wife does the word scrambles. Today, the magic word, or the mystery word, I guess it is mystery word, is Martin Luther, ironically. And I guess I'm not very good at those things, but you discover a word that's related to Luther. And today the word was indulgences, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So Luther exists in every age. But Luther, even himself, understood himself as a paradox. And I'm going to share with you a short video, God willing it works. Rick Steves, some of you know, runs a travel service. He happens to be a Lutheran and does a lot of stuff in Europe. And let's see if this works now. There we go. Luther understood himself as this contradiction in a sense, as a sinner saint. And Luther still matters today. If many of you know or have been to the Martin Luther King Memorial, but it's interesting to remember that in 1934, Michael King Sr. Visited Germany to attend the World Alliance, or the Baptist World Alliance meeting. And while he was there, he was so impressed with Luther as a person of conscience. Mind you, he was at the same time seeing the rise of the Nazis in that period of time, the difficulties facing Germany. And so when he came back, though, interestingly enough, he was so impressed by the story of Martin Luther's Reformation, he decided to change his name and the name of his then 5-year-old son to Martin Luther King. And I think you all know the rest of the story. But what does Martin Luther today have to do with, shall we say, Bill 21 in Quebec, the SNC-Lavalin scandal, the Uyghurs in China? And if you were watching yesterday the events in Washington with Mitt Romney's statement, I put this in this morning, and if you really want a case study of some of the things I'm going to talk about, watch his statement on the internet, but also listen to what happened at the prayer breakfast this morning. And you'll see exactly, Donald Trump came out and basically said he was uncomfortable with people who took positions based on their faith, something to that, and was very critical of people who pray for other people when in fact they don't. There's a slam at Nancy Pelosi. But I think this is another interesting case study, because one of the things that we understand from Luther, that goes back to Luther, is his focus on the individual person, the individual conscience, and particularly the importance of freedom of conscience, which was central for Luther and not always practiced, I might say. We'll say some more about that in a minute. But the interesting thing is the whole notion of religious freedom, the freedom of conscience that is possessed by individuals. Now, but I'm going to say some things here. One has to understand that many of these things, there were people who took positions of conscience, as Luther did, and had attitudes about conscience and freedom, about individuals as well, were shared. But Luther was, in a sense, was at a moment in time when this became the kind of major thing, became a major focus, and was picked up on in large measure. Luther himself defends his writings. Many of you know this passage. If you've been raised in Luther, this is sort of one of the sacred texts of Luther. There's movies of this capturing this significant moment, embellished, I might say, quite significantly, where Luther has to defend his works before the emperor at the Diet at Worms. And when he's there, at the end, he's allegedly said that unless you can prove this, that I should recant these writings based on scripture and reason, then I cannot. It's a matter of conscience. Here I stand, I can do no others. The big tagline that was given to that moment. Now, interestingly enough, as with many things with Luther, there's not any recorded example or recorded indication that Luther actually said this, but it's become part of the way people understand what he did at that moment. Now, what's significant here, and where we're going to go with our discussions today about Luther's very public ethics, is that Luther's justification by grace alone starts or asserts, and it starts and begins with the individual conscience of a person, the inner individual conscience. This is where Luther begins. And it asserts that a clear conscience, a clear inner private moral conscience, is the basis for outer public goods works. This is the kind of, if you've read anything about Luther, justification is that a clear conscience liberates people to serve and to undertake public works based on that. Now I'm going to say some more about that, but this is the kind of key thing. So conscience, the individual, is the starting point. By the way, we will see where this goes, this focus on the individual in a couple moments. But the argument I'm going to make, let's step back. First, when we talk about ethics, and we're talking about Luther's very public ethics, what do we mean by ethics? The simple way to understand ethics is, what is a good life? And good is an operative word here. It means different things for different people, I'm sure. But good is this thing, what are we to aspire that's noble and a way that's enviable and reflects our values and our principles and all those kinds of things? What is the good life? That's the nature of ethics. And so the argument I'm going to share with you this afternoon looks at this from the point of view, Luther's point of view, which says God grants or justifies a clear conscience to a private conscience to individuals. People's conscience is clear. That then frees them for a vocation in the world as a public person, to work in a public way. And being that public person has a particular direction to it, and that is to lovingly do works for the good of their neighbors and for the common good. So it's other focused. And the last part we will look at is that how these works, this ethics, in fact, results in shared stories that offer a meaningful worldview for the good life. Because in a sense, if you're going to talk about what is a good life, you need to have some vision of what constitutes the good life. So this is essentially the argument that we're going to make, and we'll look at probably 3 of these sections, and then the 4th after the coffee break. So let's start with the individual and their justified conscience, if that's and loosely I describe Luther's ethics. For me, I think others have used this term, that Luther's ethics is an ethics of gratitude in a large measure, being thankful for what's happened. So we need to begin, first of all, we talked about indulgences. You've heard about indulgences. The indulgence controversy, where Luther, posts the 95 Theses. Again, that's not documented to be true. There's some evidence to suggest, as Bob Kelly noted, that maybe he didn't post them, and even if he did, they would have been in Latin and probably for academic debate, so not that accessible to everyone. But the indulgence controversy is a symptom of what was taking place in the 16th century we might call salvation anxiety. There was a penitential piety that had come into sort of medieval Catholicism probably in the 11th, 12th centuries. The 11th century, I think, is when they introduced private confession. And gradually over the years what happened is that the idea, Catholics, Lutherans, Christians generally believe in grace. That's not the problem. The problem was that over the years within the medieval church, merit had sort of worked its way in to the understanding of what had to be done in terms to merit God's grace. It wasn't ironclad. There were many people who reflected a more generous view of grace, but this had crept into the kind of piety and practice of the church. And in Luther's time, people were very concerned about salvation. How could I be assured that I would be right with God, that I would achieve salvation? Now, when we talk about salvation, it's important to understand or remember for a moment what it's about. And Augustine, I think, gives us the goal, a life's goal. When we talk about salvation, the goal of life is to return to God, to be reunited with God. And Augustine uses this imagery. He says, "Thou hast made for us thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until we find our rest in thee." The idea is returning to God. Now, one way of imagining this, if you imagine climbing to the top of a high mountain, and the clouds have filled the valley, so you can't see the valley below, but you see over in the distance another destination, another mountaintop, the dwelling place of God, so beautiful, so wonderful that you want to be there. Augustine, you get this glimpse of the glory of God, and you remember it. And then you journey back down into the world to complete the journey to reach that ultimate destination. Life is a journey back to God. And you get bounced around in life and disoriented, and things happen to you. One of the things that we'll talk about is sin gets you off course in some sense because you're separated from God. So the importance is trying to take this journey back to God. And this was, so how do you get there? How do you assure that you're going to get to the destination of being reunited with God? Being right with God is the language that was often used. Now, why is this important? Having one of the great fears, of course, in this time was to die and not be faithful, to have abandoned the faith or be tempted by the devil. So you'll see all sorts of woodcuts and things about the devil coming to try and tempt you away from God, to get off course with all of this, to go in a different direction. And they're kind of horrific. In fact, so they had many manuals that were developed to give to priests and for pastoral care, to tell people how to hang tough, to stay and not be tempted and dissuaded from this ultimate reunion with God. And these manuals were very important. And in fact, one of the things they have also today, when we think about MAID, for example, medical assistance in dying, it has some relevance to that, because many people are asking, what is the good life, and how have I achieved a good life, and how will I at the end. Now, one of the important things, when I said that Luther was concerned about individuals, conscience, and all that, one of the outcomes of that today, and his notion, the idea of freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, which is big. And by the way, this is what Mitt Romney was appealing to yesterday at his news conference, and which I think Donald Trump so cavalierly trampled on this morning. Is that one of the outcomes of that has been the notion of the individual and the dignity of the individual. The individual person, why are they central? Because they bear the image of God. And so when you see a person, the divine spark of life is in them, and that unites all people together because we all bear a part. We all bear that image within us that connects us to God in some ways. So this whole notion of the individual human dignity becomes central to the doctrine of human rights. And if you look at the Article 2 in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you'll see the 4 fundamental freedoms, and one of those is the freedom of conscience and religion. It was very important. The other thing that's important to note is that following World War II, Otto Nolde, who was the dean of the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, worked with Eleanor Roosevelt to help write the preamble to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and Article 18, which is the article on religious freedom, which is which China has is in violation of with the Uyghurs today. 1 million Uyghurs incarcerated. It's the largest incarceration based on religion and ethnicity since the Second World War, and this is a very significant thing. So, in some ways, one of the connections to Luther is to this whole notion of human rights. Now, I should say, which I didn't probably say it as clearly as I needed to, that when I'm talking about Luther's ethics, I'm not just merely giving you what Luther would have said. I'm trying to talk about the consequences, the outcomes of what Luther launched in terms of his thinking, which may, in fact, Luther may have very much, as we will see, disagree with in some ways. But Luther set a trajectory for ethics, and that's what I'm trying to look at based on Luther, where he would go with these kinds of things. So when we talk about the individual, we need this, and this journey back to God, for example. Luther was known for what some would call Christian realism, or realism just short. He understood the human dilemma. And we all understand the human dilemma. Paul, in writing to the church, the congregation in Rome, had it, I think, the best summary of it. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I'm not going to ask you to raise hands, but you know what? I bet you if we asked, if you look inside yourself, you can all think of something you did, which is not something you're very proud of. By the way, when Trudeau with the brown face incidents during the election, you remember that? And there was a big, of course you remember it. There was a big thing in the media. It was very interesting, the disconnect between the pundit class and, in fact, people. The pundit class thought this was the political poison pill for the whole election. But when people were asked, even people from racialized communities and others, no one liked it. No one felt it was okay. But the interesting thing was they probably also thought, I got stuff too, And if you predate social media, you're lucky, I guess. But if you don't, it may pop up too. So I think this is kind of interesting. But anyway, on this great journey back to God, sin is the great equalizer. And when we talk about sin, we have to understand that sin is anything that separates us from God and from other people. That's a simple definition. Unfortunately, many people equate it with strictly sexuality. I suppose if a pastor or a priest or stood up in the pulpit and said, I have sinned, they wouldn't think he cheated on his taxes, which kind of. So we've reduced sin to something sort of not quite adequate. But for our purposes here, what's really important to understand is sin is a kind of great equalizer in a way. In Luther's time, it was described as incurvatus in se, the self turned inward on itself. Now, if you want to, you ever seen these selfie sticks today? It's kind of a metaphor for our society. There's a certain sense in which sin is about being obsessed with the selfie stick. In a way, I can't resist that. I know if I offend your political sensibilities, believe me, I'm an equal opportunity critic. But Donald Trump is a kind of poster boy for that, right? His State of the Union, I think he used I and my more than any other president in the entire history of the United States. No, I'm just kidding. But do you know what I mean? There's a focus on, it's an inward focus, not an outward focus. This is a very important difference that Luther makes. Because Luther distinguishes between the inner private person, your inner being of who you are, and that inner person is the one that's justified, who God acquits, who gives a clear conscience to. You don't deserve it. You're guilty as charged, but your conscience is clear, right? And he distinguishes the inner private person from the outer public person, who is called to neighbor love, that is to say, to do good for others, for their community and stuff. And this is an important distinction we're going to kind of keep going with a little bit. But it's important for this reason. Because to have a public person, the public person is crucial for creating publics. And I'm going to speak about publics in a minute when we pick that up next. But the public person is important for the convening, creation, and role that publics will play. Luther, the treatise that he wrote on this was called The Freedom of the Christian, on Christian liberty. It appears in a number of different books. But he has this quote, and you catch this at the bottom there, where he says, a Christian is a perfectly free lord of all, subject to none, and that's in their inner life, in their conscience, that's cleared by God. And a Christian is perfectly dutiful servant to all, subject to all, in their outward public life. So you get the distinction here? It's a much more nuanced approach to understanding how people are and work. By the way, the famous, for those of you who are Reinhold Niebuhr fans, and it was a great theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, Doug Hall, if you're from the United Church, you may know Doug Hall, very respected people in terms of, and who saw themselves as kind of Christian realists in this kind of a tradition. So often when we think about this, it often comes up when we talk about ethics, is, you run into people who say, well, I live by the 10 Commandments, right? I live by the 10 Commandments, that's the way I organize my life. Well, no you don't, not according to Luther. In fact, no one really can live by the 10 Commandments. So Luther outlines three, and Luther juxtaposes, this is another one of these paradoxes in a way that points to something. Law and gospel. It's a big thing for Lutherans if you're from that tradition. But the law are all the shoulds. right? And if you want to think about it, all the 10 Commandments are kind of like shoulds, right? It's bigger. The law is bigger than just the 10 Commandments, but in a sense, these shoulds are, you should do this, you should do that. These are the kind of way we understand the law. The gospel is about forgiveness and acquittal, right? It's the promise that God forgives you for this. Now, when we talk about living in the role of the 10 Commandments, or living by the 10 Commandments, one of the things that's really crucial here is that Luther distinguishes at least two uses of the law, and there's a third. This is a little more contested among scholars and Lutherans as well, Lutheran thinkers. But the first use of the law is the political or civil use of the law. And by that, this is for magistrates, government officials. You're going to put in laws. Use the law is a way of putting these in place. And it's primarily for maintaining law and order. What's the law about? It's constraining bad actors, people who are going to disrupt the peace, people who are violent, people who don't necessarily act in ways that they should. So the first use of the law is the political or civil use of the law. The second use of the law, interestingly enough, is called the forensic use of the law, or the evangelical use of the law. And here it is. This is about helping you to have a guilty conscience. If you don't have one, you should, right? And reading the 10 Commandments, if you read them, they should convict you of the ways in which you have fallen short. This is short form. I'm simplifying to be sure. But the law then convicts us of the kinds of things that we should feel guilty for. And so these two uses of law are very, very much part of the Lutheran tradition, Luther's approach. Of course, having a guilty conscience, then being justified by God and having your conscience cleared or acquitted, then allows you to move into the world to serve your neighbor. This is important. This is the important yin and yang of the way Luther does ethics or suggests ethics. The third use of the law is the transformative use of the law. And this is probably more like what people mean when they say, well, I live by the 10 Commandments. It's a kind of guide that gives you some direction. By the way, this painting is by Lucas Cranach. It reflects this kind of tension between law and gospel. But this transformative use of the law is a guide. It's kind of like a moral compass. Now, as I said, some more traditional Lutheran scholars don't like the third. This is called the third use of the law. But I think increasingly people are starting to revisit it, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But if we want to look for some examples where Luther uses a transformative approach or a positive use of the law to guide public life, for example, and this is Luther talked about the priesthood of all believers. Luther was a bit of a disruptor. There are a couple people who wrote that said he's a lot like Donald Trump. That's a bit of a stretch for me, but Luther did disrupt the kind of order in his day. And one of the things he disrupted was the hierarchical clerical order. So that when you talked about what was a good life, the life was ranked. If you were married, that was a good thing. If you became a priest, that was another step up. If you became a bishop, there was this kind of hierarchy, this ladder of merit or worthiness. Luther offered a more egalitarian vision of where people were at. Now, that's in theory, because in practice, Luther was a law and order guy. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Luther had this egalitarian approach to things. Luther also ended the monastic system of almsgiving and charity. He thought the monasteries were not that these were people who were not doing honest work. This was a kind of a false lifestyle, and so he disbanded the monasteries. He expected people to be much more into the community, live in the community. But the trouble was that when he did that, the monasteries did serve a very important role. They were like social welfare agencies. Poor people could go to the monasteries, from some monasteries, get help and support and those kinds of things. So when you disbanded that, then Luther and his followers talked about the order of the communal purse and the Leisnig order, which was for a community chest. And when you think about welfare systems today, they can probably trace their origins back to saying public officials have a responsibility to provide for the poor. And this, the Leisnig Ordinance, basically was used and adopted in cities, not only Lutheran Protestant cities, but also Catholic ones as well. And Philip Melanchthon, I won't go into this, but Philip Melanchthon and Luther were very big on education, and education became a very important emphasis for Luther. In fact, you know, the idea of kindergarten, I don't know if what he would have done with junior kindergarten, but the origin of kindergarten traces its origins back to Luther and Melanchthon and this period. So we've talked about the private person. The conscience is cleared and free. Which means you're then called to be a public person. So what is a public person supposed to do? Vocation means, it was often seen that in previous to this, that vocation meant a clerical vocation, an ordained vocation. Luther expands that in a lot of ways. And the public person is driven by what? An imperative to neighbor love. This Cynthia Molabita, who's a Lutheran scholar, uses the term neighbor love to summarize love your neighbor as yourself kind of thing. This is the kind of terms, and she's developed a whole notion of this around being public churches. But a public person is driven by neighbor love. And this is a very important thing to understand in some ways. Neighbor love involves more than just our individual actions. It's not just what I do. People are not rugged individuals. The South African Klaus Nürnberger talks about people being communal individuals. There's a lovely thing Africans say when they talk about Ubuntu, which is, I am because we are, right? You know, there's a sense in which you need to be reciprocal. Your humanity depends on others. You cannot be fully human alone. And so this is a little different than what many people think of today. I'm my own person. I can do my own thing, you know. I remember Timothy Lull was a Luther scholar at Pacific Lutheran in California, and he was on a plane one time, and a guy was sitting next to him boasting about how he was a self-made guy. He'd done this himself. He'd climbed the corporate ladder, and everything he achieved he'd done for himself. And Lull looks over him, he says, "Who changed your diaper?" No one is a person that is on their own created. The late Vitor Westteller, who is a Brazilian theologian, I think has a lovely way of describing how humans cooperate with God. Luther would go, I might be wrong in this, but Luther would almost say that whatever you do, when you do good things for your neighbor, when you engage in neighbor love, it's Christ working through you, right? And it's all about Christ doing this. Westteller takes it a little bit and says, well, look, it's a little different than that. It's in fact, it is that, Christ working through you, but you are a participant with Christ in this. It's not a kind of, he would shy away from saying that these are good works that you do all on your own. No, but it's kind of like we rented some bikes one time, these electrical bikes you could ride. You know, they look like a bike, but they have a battery or something, and when you pedal them, they go twice as fast or 3 times as fast. There's a certain sense in which you're doing something, but you have a lot of power behind you that's not from you, and I think this is kind of where Westteller is going. So what we're talking about is how do we be little Christs loving our neighbor. The public person is liberated to live a life of gratitude, thankfulness. You know, if you think back about something that you had a guilty conscience for, and what happened when someone said, it's okay. I remember when I was in school, we were on a playground one time, and Stephen Brown, we're playing football or whatever we're doing, and I ran into Stephen Brown, and he ran into me, bang, and all of a sudden, the teachers came around, and they took him away, and took him off to the hospital, and he had broken his collarbone, and so he was out of school for 3 days, and I felt absolutely terrible about that. I just, it bugged me, I couldn't sleep, and I even remember it to this day, obviously, right? And then, so I got on my bike, and I rode up to his house. And I go up, and I knock on the door, and he comes to the door. He's got his hand in the sling. And I said, listen, geez, Stephen, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to do this. Well, we were horsing around, and something was going to happen. And he just looked at me and said, it was an accident. You didn't do it. It was an accident. It's okay. And we were friends all through high school after that. But the sense of relief that you have when someone says, it's okay, you're acquitted, is a kind of liberating feeling, isn't it? But you're liberated to lead a life of gratitude in loving service to your neighbor. And I want to say something about love here, because God knows with all the soap operas and the reality TV shows and Meet the Bachelor or whatever these things are, these programs have kind of crippled love in a lot of ways in terms of a theological or a Christian sense of what we would mean. The great theologian Paul Tillich defined Christian love this way. He said, love is moving power of life. Love is the drive toward the unity of what is separated. Now you think about it. The world pulls us apart, tears us apart, divides people. There are all sorts of things going on in the world. And in fact, love is about pulling it back together. And this is kind of important. In the Jewish tradition, Judaism speaks of tikkun olam, those acts of loving kindness performed for the repair and to make the world better. Interesting. And there are, if you've read C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, there are 4 different kinds of loves. But the loves that, as Christians understand it, or as Luther might understand it, is about putting people, communities, and creation back together again. It's not about what's in it for me. And that's a lot of what we get, what we see. So let's just quickly look at what we've learned from Luther to this point about an ethics of gratitude and Luther's notion of radical grace. There's nothing you do that earns the forgiveness of God. That's basically what Luther's saying. Your conscience is cleared because God loves you. Period. So God's justification makes people good from the inside out, not from the outside in, which was at the time the kind of Roman view that was being offered. Today, by the way, it's not so simple. There is a lot of ways in which these traditions overlap and are different. But in one sense, this was a key difference for Luther, from the inside out rather than from the outside in. Christian realism understands our human dilemma. We're not as good as we think we are. And our propensity to do the wrong thing is usually the case rather than our propensity to do the right thing. So we need to deal with that. But we need to remember that there's a dignity to each person that matters. The conscience of the flawed individual is justified daily by remembering God's baptismal promise. It is a reset button. Alan Jorgensen, I think, mentioned this, and Debbie Lou, I think, mentioned it in her presentation last week about remembering your baptism, you know. And I think this is really is important. Why is remembering your baptism important? For Luther, it wasn't about the water and about the ceremony and being part of a nice church and all that kind of stuff. It was remembering that in baptism, God made a promise. It's like the theological Groundhog Day. Did you see that movie, right? Every day you wake up and it's the rebutton and replay. But it's like that in a sense that the promise is made for you. Every day your conscience, your guilty conscience, is cleared because God loves you. That's the baptismal promise. Now, you know, when you've seen people make the sign of the cross, I used to hate that because when I played basketball, we played against the Catholic schools, and those guys always would get on a foul line and they'd go like this and they'd sink their 2 shots. We didn't have that, and we usually miss. But the reality is, when people make the sign of the cross, it's about remembering your baptism, right? It's about remembering that God made a promise to you. And that's very important for Luther and Central. It kind of resets the button for you. Now, that doesn't absolve you from accountability. If we want to talk about that too, that's another thing. But it does, in terms of your conscience, reset that. It allows freedom for a responsible life of gratitude and public service to neighbor. You're free to do good things then. You're free to do things. And life here is a slight difference from Augustine. Life is not a journey back to God. You're already on the distant mountain with God, and you're journeying down into the world to serve and love your neighbor. You get the difference? It's very important in terms of how you locate what you're doing. So this is kind of Luther, in a synopsis, Luther's ethics of gratitude based on his notion of justification or radical grace. So let's talk about convening publics as an imperative for the good life and serving this public person, serving their neighbor and their community and creation. And I think that's important. Alan made this point, I think, a couple of weeks ago that and when Luther, when he was asked what he'd do if he was the last day and he knew he was going to die tomorrow, he'd say, "I plant a tree," right? So there is some kind of connection, I think, that we need to keep in mind. Creation is also part of this today. So let's talk about the public imperative in Luther. And this is, I think, now moving on. Maybe Luther wouldn't have described it this way, but I think he set some of these things in motion. The liberated person, in a sense, becomes, we talked about little Christ to the neighbor, but also the liberated person becomes the hands and feet of God. And there was a little, in the Steve's video we just saw, you remember Luther said, if you sin, go sin boldly, right? It takes the risk out of it. This is the point, right? If you're worried about it doing the wrong thing, what Luther, when he was writing to Melanchthon, was telling his friend that, look, you get out there, you're doing the best you can in the world, and you might make some mistakes, and some things are going to go wrong. So sin boldly, but cling ever more to Christ, because through Christ, God has made a promise to continually absolve your conscience and relieve your conscience so that you can go back and do more and be relentless in your public service. Well, the interesting thing about we all have the image of Luther, as we saw in the video, banging the thesis or nailing the thesis to the door. But Luther actually, it was maybe a little different than that. Luther, Tetzel. Tetzel was the guy who was the indulgence guy going around selling all these indulgences. And Tetzel decided that, well, you better respond to Luther with these theses because he's going to undermine your business, put it crassly. And so he wrote a piece, Tetzel, and Luther looked at this piece and decided not to respond in Latin, because Luther actually was trying originally to probably trigger an academic debate. People were talking about the indulgences, but he responded in German. And what's significant about that, he wrote a sermon on indulgence and grace that it was an instant publishing success. There were 14 editions of 1,000 copies each. Now you think about this. Wittenberg is a dinky little place in these days. This is a huge publishing success, and we'll talk some more about that in a minute. But Luther, in a sense, went public. He went right over the heads of the academy, right over the heads of the church, and people who were starting to read things picked up on it. So we need to understand that Luther had what I would call many publics. He had the German public, his academic public, his publishing public, and certainly his political public. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those quickly before we get to coffee. But I want to say something about what I mean by a public. Some of you have heard me say this ad nauseum, so forgive me if it's new to you. I hope it'll be refreshing. If not, it's old ground we're covering again. But a public, we often use the term public as it's government, right? Public is the government, private is business, right? Well, that's a very false kind of way of understanding it. A public, for me, is a voluntary association of individuals who gather around an idea or a cause, and in the process of coming together are changed, and then in turn affect a change in society or in their community. So it brings people together and changes them, and they in turn change. Public ethics, and this is where we're going with Luther's public ethics, does a number of things. It convenes publics, and a public, by the way, is not your family. It's a company, and Parker Palmer calls it a company of strangers, people who are not related to you, who are bound together by a common cause or purpose or issue, and who come together around that and then in turn go into the world. Public ethics convenes publics. It engages in a community-based process of moral deliberation, thinking about things that matter. It addresses compelling personal and social ethical dilemmas. A dilemma is when you're stuck with. You remember Tevier and Fiddler on the Roof? He's got these dilemmas. His daughters all want to do marriage differently, and he's trying to struggle with, on the one hand, this and that. And you got to tease out the question. Well, ethics is about knowing what a dilemma is and figuring it out. The first question of ethics is not whether it's right or wrong. The first question of ethics, in my modest view, is what's happening here? What's going on? Public ethics also enlists our ultimate convictions and deepest values as global citizens. This is a much longer thing, but there are things that matter to you, that you ultimately believe in, right? Reinhold Niebuhr, I mentioned earlier, said, everyone ought to have a hill to die on, just not too many of them. But the fact of the matter is, or as someone once said, if you fall for everything, if you don't stand for something, you fall for everything. Or you've heard that quote too. This is about those ultimate convictions and values. And public ethics is used to address or resolve an issue or life question of misery or meaning in the world. These are the twin crises we face. So let's look at some of his publics. This is what I mean by, by the way, and these publics, there are many of them, come together in what we would call the body politic. They interact with each other. You see people protesting or engaged in actions, in fact, they're different groups, different sides. These multiple publics make the body politic work. Most obviously, we have various political parties, for example. And political parties have to convene publics. If you want to get elected, you've got to bring people together around a cause or a purpose, get them invested in it, or identify that they believe in it, and then they, in fact, go and do something about it. So politicians are master conveners, good ones. There are some bad ones, but good ones, in fact, know how to convene publics and to get people behind things. So the body politic is composed of many, many different publics. Just as an aside, too, there are publics that aren't necessarily noble, right? These people get together. Some of the racist groups we've seen, for example, they're publics, but they're not necessarily good publics. So publics in and of themselves are not inherently good. All right, let's look at some of Luther's publics. The first was the German national public. Luther went from obscurity to being a celebrity, a national hero, an icon of the resistance. He was the hero of Germany, right? To resisting the oppression of Rome in some ways. Much more complicated than that, but Luther's Bible gave rise to a literate German public. He created a language, a tool to learn reading and writing. By the way, these are pictures. The top picture up there is the Wartburg Castle, where Luther hid out after the Diet. He had safe passage, but when, as Bob mentioned, he was quote-unquote kidnapped, Elector Frederick stashed him in the castle there for, I think, almost a year it was. And during that time, he translated in 11 weeks from 1521 to 1522, the New Testament at that desk right there. That was his study. That was what he looked like. The picture, he was incognito. He was disguised as Junker George, I think was Knight George as well. Johann Goethe, the very famous novelist and philosopher, German philosopher, when he went to that room, stood there and said, "Only through Luther did we become a people, one nation. Did we find a common language?" It's very interesting. So Luther very much created a German public. Luther his printers became his a public of publishers. Yes, a little like a twisted line there. In The Economist, they talked about how Luther went viral, how he, before Facebook and the Arab Spring and all that stuff, he brought about the Reformation by, in fact, creating a public of people who were reading his stuff. The Andrew Pettigrew, who's looked at this, said the paradox of Luther is that printing was crucial to the creation of Luther. Everybody talks about, the printing press and so forth and so on. The technology helped Luther. But Luther, in turn, created a publishing industry. And there's a difference, right? Printing is about technology. Publishing is about reading and knowledge and discernment and that kind of thing. There were approximately just to give you an example, 6 to 7 million pamphlets printed during the first decade of the Reformation. 1/4 of those were Luther's. He exponentially outpublished everybody, and everybody was reading him. And after Luther, the thing that is important to understand, there was a huge public demand for news and information. People wanted to know. They wanted to know what happened. And so as a result, you had the birth of things like the newspaper and the media and all that kind of stuff. So Luther very much had the printers, these were not just printing documents. This was a public of Luther. And he negotiated with people. He was a tough negotiator. And if he'd have someone that was writing from their side, from the Lutheran side or the Protestant side, he'd put them with one publisher and he would take them away from another one to negotiate the best, to maximize the public input or the public impact. The other one that's really important, and we'll spend a little minute of time on this just before we go to break, is Luther's political public. His support came from the regional ruler wannabes, princelings, I might call them, who had no real power to resist Rome. They were a little bit farther down the food chain than the people at the top of the heap, and they had little influence. And they really felt they were being overtaxed, they were being exploited, that they had no influence or any of that, and they needed a theological justification. So Luther writes two pieces. He wrote other things as well, but the two notable ones are To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation and Temporal Authority, to what extent it should be obeyed. And Luther puts out this idea of two kingdoms, that there's the kingdom of grace, which is the church, his role, care of the soul, and God is ruler over all of this, the world, but the church has a particular responsibility in this arena, and the kingdom of the world, and that was where the temporal rulers' world, and their principal task was to maintain peace. No, that's Canadian, peace, order, and good government. No, peace and order, and restrain evildoers. Karen Armstrong points out that Luther was the first European Christian to advocate for separation of church and state. Now, what's important here is twofold. One is to understand, when we talk about church and state today, or when we talk about religion today, we think of religion, well, this is religion, and this is business, and this is whatever. We've got them in little silos. Religion in Luther's day, by the way, I don't think that really works so well in theory or in practice, but that's sort of our conception of things. In Luther's day, religion was infused throughout everything. So to take religion out, it was like trying to take the flavor out of ice cream, right? I mean, you ever seen kids, they stir it, or I mean, it's all infused in everything. You couldn't separate it in the same way. And so what Luther, in effect, ends up doing here is creating what we would call public space. A space that is different than the church, the religious space, sacred space, different than other kind of spaces. It's a space where people can come together. I often refer to it as the public commons, but we can talk about that some other time. And what Luther does here is he distinguishes in this framework two kinds of righteousness for two kingdoms. One is Christian righteousness, coram Deo. Christian righteousness is based on the gospel. God justifies you, forgives you your sins, clears your conscience. It focuses on the private, inner, individual conscience. It's being right with God. It's dependent on God's radical grace, and it pertains to Christians. On the other hand, you have civil righteousness, coram mundo, which is the law, seeking right relationships in public. It's doing the right thing in the world, serving your neighbor. It's dependent on human character, people who do the right thing. But you don't have to be a person of faith. You don't have to be a Christian. It can be anybody. Now, why is this important? Because, in fact, civil righteousness allows that any rational creature to engage in moral actions as law-abiding citizens. It makes public ethics and action possible between Christians and others. Let me give you an example. When we took on Queen's Park around ISARC was a group that took on issues of hunger, homelessness, and poverty. You didn't have to be a Christian to be part of it. You could work with any faith tradition. We worked with labor unions. We worked with community groups. The same was true, by the way, in the apartheid struggle. Many groups, we were supported. Churches had a reason for taking on that issue, very instrumental in bringing an end to apartheid. But anyway, the reality is you don't have to be Christian to engage in public to be a public initiatives, and that was kind of important. So civil righteousness, by the way, one of the problems you have is that today, when you look at some of the, and forgive me if I offend anybody's sensibilities, but the religious right today confuses this. It muddies it. It's Christian righteousness. You know, in Brazil now they have a campaign to end Planned Parenthood kind of programs and health education programs. And one of the things they base this on is, you know, this is the kind of moral, this is the Christian moral view. And Pentecostals are very strong in pushing this. But in fact, it muddies the waters between Christian righteousness and civil rights. And you see this in the United States, too, to some extent. And if you listen to Trump's news conference this morning, you see it in spades. We're going to take, I think we're at the break, right? Are we ready? Pretty much looks like the coffee's ready. We'll come back, we'll pick up on the unethical Luther for a minute, and then talk about worldviews. But anyway, thank you very much. We'll see you after the break. I think as we move along, one of the things that we need to deal with in the next part, it's a little difficult, is the when you talk about Luther's ethics, what do you do with the unethical Luther? And this is the part that often hadn't been talked about for a number of years. But Luther had some serious problems. He was a man of extremes. As I said, some people have described him much along the lines of Donald Trump as a disruptor. I think he had other things going for him that the president doesn't have. Let's put it that way. But there was a sense that he was a person who didn't like compromise. He didn't favor middle ground. He was very polemic, prone to violent outbursts, vulgar language, and offensive language at times. And I know Daniel Maus is coming in a couple weeks to talk about Luther and anti-Jewish anti-Semitism. But I want to talk about these things just to name them for you, to say that we need to think about them in some ways. For example, Luther called the papacy, by the way, he didn't call the Pope in particular, the individual, but he called the papacy the Antichrist fairly regularly, which was a big problem as you got to the 20th century when there was a rapprochement and Lutherans signed the Joint Declaration on Justification in 1999 where they said they agreed on justification essentially. So how do you have a rapprochement between these two traditions when the person who was instrumental in the founding of it used such vitriolic language? He wrote despicable and vile anti-Jewish tracts, such as the one against the Jews and their lies, which were later used by the Nazis and still surface in Germany today from some of the extreme right-wing groups there. I won't get into this in a lot of detail, but just to say that the Lutheran Church in Canada was one of the first to condemn those writings of Luther. This wasn't easy. Many people see Luther as the patron saint. They didn't get the sinner part, which is part of why Rick Steves produced the video you saw earlier. But the reality is these were despicable pieces and not to be accepted by those who are his descendants. Luther was complicit and in this area is important, was complicit in the persecution of Anabaptists, which resulted in 3,000 Anabaptists being executed. Thousands more were imprisoned, tortured, and exiled. Harry Lowen's written a good book about this. It's a sad part of here in this community, the relationships are excellent. And in fact, in that assembly I told you about where I became Luther's fan, that assembly passed a document, an apology, and I forget the name, the World Mennonite Organization was present as well, and began the process of trying to say, how do we heal some of these historical divisions? But these were horrific treatment of Anabaptists, and one looks back in the history. It's interesting, by the way, in the case of his writings against the Jews and to some extent about the Anabaptists, he didn't have a lot of those people living nearby. He didn't meet a lot of these people. This didn't happen. So it makes them doubly unacceptable and certainly worth being condemned. The last one I'll mention is the Peasants Revolt. Luther wrote against the murderous band of peasants, calling upon the nobles to stab, beat, and strangle the peasants. That's his quote. And they did. They slaughtered them. And in fact, initially their demands, they looked to Luther. They thought what he was saying would be he'd be supportive, and he wasn't. Now, Daniel's going to pick up on some of this stuff in the weeks ahead. I just mentioned them here. These are things which, in fact, Lutheran traditions have in fact condemned and said are not acceptable to us and don't support in the harshest terms. By the way, the last one, dealing with economic justice for the peasants, and remember, it was, well, we'll talk about that some other time, but it was a very difficult time for the peasants to make ends meet. Just to give you an example, Spain had come to the New World and was pumping all the wealth of the indigenous people back into Europe. The Italians were taxing everybody and bringing money into Rome. And the German population was contributing, but they had no sources of wealth. In some sense, it was a time of inflation and difficult economic times for these people. So when these revolts took place, it was rather harsh, the response that Luther gave. And in fact, Latin American Lutherans, like Walter Altman and others, don't accept this. Vitor Westphal don't accept Luther's treatment of this. They put a different spin on it and try to talk about what the demands of economic justice require. Anyway, let's talk about why. I want to just say briefly in terms of the overall approach to ethics, why what we need to learn from this is probably the issue. The first thing we need to learn is Luther was steeped in an authoritarian culture, and authority was important to him. And so we have to ask the question, what about authoritarianism? Some writers have said Luther was the father of authoritarianism because you remember his political public, right? He was going to stick with them, and he was very loyal to them. Luther was driven by a man driven by a hunger for certainty. Luther was absolutely certain he was right about justification, right? Well, what about other sources of certainty? And as we'll see in a few moments, one of the things that replaced, and Luther, the term that was used was sola scriptura. Scripture alone was the source of authority for Luther in terms of his doctrine of justification, right? And but that was eventually replaced by reason alone, right? And in modernity, when we start talking about it, became reason. Scientific facts became the basis for certainty. So we need to question this thing of what role does certainty play in terms of our thinking? But Luther, the key thing here to understand is Luther didn't just disagree with people. He said, I just don't like what you're saying, I don't accept your argument. It wasn't that. He demonized his opponents. Whether it was the Pope, whether it was the Jewish people, whether it was the peasants, whoever, he demonized them because he understood that they were acting as agents of the devil to undermine the gospel. Now, that was his perception, right? I mean, the way he understood it. So as a result, he felt perfectly fine in casting all sorts of vulgar and vicious language at these people who opposed him. And in a sense, we need to point out that polarization is not new. So when we talk about what is ultimately important to us, our faith, our religion, those kind of things, we need to remember three things. One is we need to be self-aware about how that is heard or how that is interpreted by others. We need to be self-interrogating. The most important religious question you're going to ask yourself is, how did I change my mind and why? And to explain it. And the last is we need to be self-critical. What is it that about us, and how are we perceived out there by people? And today, I remember Reg Bibby I think it was Reg Bibby told the story about how he used to go to, he had a waitress in his congregation who worked the brunch routine, and he was saying, he says, you must be pretty busy on Sundays. That must be great. It must, be a good time to work. She says, it's terrible. We got all the church people coming for brunch. He says, what do you mean? He says, they don't tip. So how are we seen in the world? And there's a lot of people, especially on the religious right, I'm afraid to say. And one of the big battles is going to be not between the religious and those who are nuns, they call them, not religious but spiritual or whatever it is. One of the bigger battles that's shaping up is between the religious community itself over what does an authentic faith look like. Not to impose a faith on someone else, but to be self-critical, self-challenging. These things. What I often say is never believe your own propaganda. That's the bottom line. All right, so let's, and by the way, the picture up here, this is a postcard I took a picture of in the Luther House Museum in Wittenberg. where Luther lived. And you can see how, in fact, sometimes, Luther has been co-opted by the political public. There's a fascinating exhibit there that shows the many ways in which Luther's image is used. In fact, the AfD, if any of you have sat in on the populism lectures, the Alternative for Germany parties actually had banners at one point that had pictures of Luther on them, sort of as validating their political orientation. Anyway, that comes from the museum, gives you an illustration. Well, all right. What I want to talk about now is worldviews and composing our communal stories for a meaningful worldview of the good life. Remember I said earlier on that when we ask, what is the good life? We see it through a set of lenses. Just like my glasses, there are a set of lenses that, and those lenses are our worldview. And so when we talk about the good life, in fact, the way we evaluate it often is based on our way of seeing the world and what we think is important. What happened in Luther's time, well, we'll get to it in a minute, but there are sort of at least 3 or 4 worldviews that I want to speak to. One is the late medieval theological worldview that failed. The second is the modern rational worldview, the one we're in now. And the question is, what would there be a postmodern relational worldview to be determined? What would that look like? We're going to talk about that. But before we do, I want to say a few things here, first of all, about worldviews and how we get them and how ethics plays the role in getting a worldview. Faith, your faith, whatever it is, I'm not talking about what institution you're part of now. What you ultimately believe in is biographical. It defines who we are or who you are, which is part of the problem when, Mitt Romney said as much. He said, listen, I'm a religious person. Faith matters to me. That defines who I am. He actually said that. If you look at which is very true. So faith is biographical. It says who we are. Ethics, on the other hand, is autobiographical, composing our story of who we are becoming. So faith is biographical, ethics is autobiographical, who we're becoming. Now, if you ever look at the record, the lifeline, you ever see that lifelines, where they take a story of someone, right? Read those sometime. And read them to think about all the decisions that had to be made in that person's life to get them to that story, to that outcome, right? To that when their life comes to an end. And there they are. The story's told about them. And probably not all of those decisions were ethical. Some of they're decisions. They're just decisions. But a lot of them are. So ethics shapes our life story. And when publics create a worldview, when we look at all decisions we've taken as a society, it creates a worldview, an expectation about the world. I'm going to murder this in terms of German, but the Germans call it Weltschauung. I think that's right. I know there's a couple Germans here, so forgive me if I've mispronounced it. But this idea that you have a worldview that is a meaningful social ethic. And Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher from Montreal, speaks about a social imaginary. I think it's the same, similar kind of thing. Simply said, it's how the world works, how life works, and how life ought to work. A worldview tells us how the world works and how it ought to work, right? So when you look at something, and one of the big phrases these days, it is what it is. You've heard that, it is what it is kind of thing. Well, that you got to unpack it in terms of it is what it is. This is the way it's working now, but is that the way it should be working? And that's what a worldview does for you. And part of what we do together when we're doing ethics and when we're involved in public ethics, of publics coming together and thrashing these things around, is charting and directing and figuring out the direction of our world and the worldview that we're going to have. And it changes. Think about same-sex relationships, LGBTQ plus roles in society 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's very different today. Our worldview has changed about those things. So, there was a fascinating discussion about obscenities. people have a rather free use of the vernacular. Some people suggest I'm bilingual in that regard too. But what many of us in this room, learn to be obscenities are not what are obscenities for millennials and Generation Z, as they say these days. The most obscene thing you can do is to violate someone's humanity, right? So, for example, mental illness, or calling people names in that regard, or using derogatory terms about how people function, and those are obscene to millennials and the other words that we often, some scandalize when you hear people say, not so much anymore, I guess, but it's very interesting. So the worldviews change, and that's the important thing to understand about them. All right. When we talk about Luther's time, we have to understand that at his time there was a failing worldview. The world, it wasn't working for people anymore. It was like a tinder that had built up, that brush that happens on the forest floor that builds up, and then there's spark and it just takes off. And that's what Luther was. Luther was, in a sense, the spark. The worldview they had, as we mentioned, was based, there was the whole salvation anxiety symptom we mentioned. But basically, the institutions and the leadership and the thinkers were offering unconvincing assurances of salvation. So if that's the zeitgeist, the set of how am I saved, how is salvation assured for me, they weren't answering that. Religious institutions didn't address the life questions of people. And I'll be honest with you, if you go to you hear a lot of speakers that are answering questions you aren't asking, right? And it happens in our churches too. My philosophy of meetings and gatherings is you ought to go away with more than you came with. And sometimes we go to a lot of these gatherings where, we've done the things, but it's not that that our questions have been addressed. There were dynamic changes in the economy that were happening. Colonialism, Merkelism. I mentioned the Spanish influx of gold and wealth coming into Europe that was leading to inflation and dispossessing some and inequalities for others. There was growing militarism and piracy in the Mediterranean. Ships were being captured and people were taking slaves off to foreign lands. This was terrifying. There was the emergence of Renaissance values, new ways of thinking about values that hadn't been part of the traditional society. And lastly, there was political uncertainty as well. People weren't sure who was where and what was happening and all these kinds of things. Now, the Protestant Reformation, as we call it, was theological. It was about detheocratizing a pious Orthodox Catholic society. And basically, as I said, religion was infused throughout every realm of life, institutions, every sector. And so, in a sense, you were detheologizing or detheocratizing this kind of society. Very difficult to do. And we really need to think about this in bigger terms. Luther, in a sense, he was a conservative. He was a law and order guy, He was about restoring a better past. He used to say, we got to go back to the sources, go back to what it was. We're trying to get us back on track. But paradoxically, Luther unleashed public forces of what Karen Armstrong calls the Great Transformation. So we're very narrow in our thinking if we think that the Reformation was the 16th century, the early 17th century. No. Armstrong argues that it was from the 1500s to at least this millennium change. And the Great Transformation picked up the theme of how do we have a life-enhancing future, right? And religion, the medieval kind of piety and religion, was seen as an inhibitor to that. So in fact, there were many reformations. There wasn't just Luther's Reformation. There were many reformations in the lowland countries, in Holland, the Netherlands, in England. There was, of course, we know about that. And basically, even within Catholicism itself, you had the Counter-Reformation, which in fact was its own Reformation. And if you've ever been to some of the churches in Germany where they had all this ostentatious and gold and everything else, this was part of the battle against these Protestants who didn't have that stuff. And they were saying, look, come see our churches. This is the place you want to be. So there were many of these reformations. And basically, a guy by the name of Brad Gregory argues that this confessional Europe was in fact failed in two reasons. He would say that there was a confessional 16th century worldview that I was talking about, and it failed on two counts. One, it failed politically and militarily. You remember afterwards we had the 30 Years' Wars, all the conflicts that took place. And then it failed to create moral communities free that were free of religious dissent. In other words, the churches had become very divided. And the Protestants, of course, one of the criticisms was they failed to be able to live out the charity that was required, live out a life of caritas in the world. By the way, so you had this failure of a medieval worldview. It didn't work for people anymore. We're going to ask that of ourselves in a moment. But the answer that came was modernity offered a new worldview, an emerging worldview. It didn't just come overnight, but they offered two particular solutions to the problems that Gregory identifies. So to the political problems and the military problems, they ended up with the separation of church and state. Have you heard this before? Separation? This is a familiar term, right? It's not new to you. It comes from this time. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia gave rise to the emergence of nation states, right? And these nation states then would function, and there were certain protocols and things that evolved to make them work and function and relate to each other. By the way, and the second answer, I should say, came through secularization, that modernity is rational. It's not superstitious. We deal with facts and reason, right? And society's goal is to engage in progress, to get better all the time, right? Economic progress becomes important and all these kinds of things. What secularization does, though, is it quarantines religion. Where? In the individual conscience. So, which most religious people don't work that way. But anyway, and we see this today in many, many ways, where religion, the backlash against Mitt Romney was fascinating. You can look at it if you can stomach it for a while. Basically, religion has no place in public, right? This is basically it. And if you look at what happened in Quebec around Bill 21, Marie mentioned my little piece wasn't well received in Quebec, I might say. But Bill 21, the French response, the Francophone response, not just in Quebec but in France, to this conflict, this political upheaval, the wars and all that, was to in fact try and keep religion safely quarantined out of public life and at best in the individual life, and basically argued, there's a complicated argument, but there's something the French call laïcité, which means that religious rights in much of the Francophone world derive from the state. In the Anglophone world, or under our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, these are rights that don't derive from the state. They're rights you possess because you're a person. And this is a conflict that gets played out in this debate. But you can see Bill 21, some of this debate goes back to the 16th century of how you resolve these kind of problems. The great unraveling of modernity, I suppose, Gregory would argue, and I think he's onto something, that the institutional arrangements that have solved the central problem in the 16th century are creating a problem for us today. Western modernity is coming unraveled, and it's changing. Our worldview is once again changing. This is an interesting quote from Peggy Noonan from the Wall Street Journal. I mean, there's a certain sense, I love this line, we wonder if what we really have is first-class stateroom on the Titanic. Everything is wonderful, but the world is ending and we sense it. I mean, and the young people, if you went to the climate change strike in Waterloo Park and stuff, or in Waterloo Town Center, you can sense this kind of anxiety that's coming up. All right, we're moving along and then we're going to get to the questions. So we maybe need to say, is there a spirit or ethic of our postmodern time, our postmodern age? And I use that term very loosely. Some people use it to mean specific things in the academic world. But after modernity, what? Cultural anxiety may be the anxiety we face now. And it's marked by a lack of right relationships with others in creation. We can't seem to get along with people. If you go down to one of these roundabouts and watch how people go through these things, it tells you everything about our society. The disestablishment of the Christian values consensus. What I mean by that is the churches have been disestablished in Canada. This is sort of well understood. But the thing was, even after the war, even though the churches, we had the separation of church and state and all this stuff, there was a values consensus that was Judeo-Christian, generally speaking, about some things. So when you talked in public about things, you kind of could agree a bit. But that doesn't seem to be there. And we have people today we're not sure where the values, where are the incubators for the values that we want to share. If they're not in our institutions, people don't go to church, people don't join political parties. If you think the fall off in church attendance is bad, you ought to look at some of the riding associations, right? So there's a whole sense in which we need to think about these things. Where are the incubators? There's an unraveling of economic globalization and the end of capitalism, according to Wolfgang Streepe, the Max Planck Institute in Germany. He's basically, capitalism as we know it began at the time of the Reformation. Yeah, there were markets and all this stuff, and when I studied economics, they all went back to Rome and their, trading societies and blah, blah, blah. But the reality of the matter is capitalism as we know it began at the Reformation. And are we at a change now when in fact it isn't working anymore? And you know what? One of the biggest Google searches is around the word socialism. Millennium. Why is Bernie Sanders so popular among young people? Right. I mean, he's basically speaking a language. Oh, sorry. Yeah. And we have an entertainment values of individualism, consumerism, and celebrity. So, we sort of anesthetize ourselves with these things. Neil Postman once talked about our society as amusing ourselves to death, right? Anyway, so if the Reformation was about theology and modernity was about scientific rationality, might post-modernity be about an ethics of relationships and figuring out how to put that back together? So let's conclude with this, and then we'll get on to the questions. I think we're good. So what does Luther's public ethics offer us today? We need to remember people are dignified and flawed communal individuals, private people with a public purpose. Human rights and social responsibility matter. And by the way, when governments in Ontario or the United States or China or India trample over individual rights, we all should be very, very worried about that. Publics themselves matter, and public spaces are important for shaping the common good. We need to guard against those who would dominate and exploit the public commons. By that I mean religion infused everything in society in the 16th century, all the institutions. It was the meaning impulse through a lot of this stuff. Today, what's the impulse for us? Business. Business, and this is not about being against business people. We need people to generate wealth. But that business, John Ralston Saul calls it the unconscious civilization. It has infused all of our institutions in society. So how do we think about that, and how do we put it? I mean, we don't do business people a favor when they become the force for meaning in our society. We do them a favor when we let them do what they do well, which is run business and not shape the direction of everything else. An ethics of gratitude may be more effective than an ethics of merit or entitlement. Everybody deserves everything. Everybody's entitled to things today. Ethics of gratitude is other-focused. Ethics of merit is personal-focused. I deserve this. And ethics of gratitude is what I need to do for you. Lastly, just as Scripture alone came with problems, reason alone may not be enough today. I mentioned that earlier. And the final thing is, going back to Luther, live with it. Ambiguity rather than certainty may be more instructive. Luther didn't take his own advice on this, right? But I think it may be that trying to be right may be the enemy of doing the right thing. And so some things we just can't fix and we can't get. So we need to be with it until we can sort of figure out what we're going to do with it. I love Martin Luther King Jr., Michael King Jr.'s quote here, that the old law about an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. The time is always right to do the right thing. So there we go. Thank you.
You've been listening to When Doing the Right Thing Doesn't Make You Right, Martin Luther's Very Public Ethics, the fifth talk in an 8-lecture series titled Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This lecture series was presented at Rim Park in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, through January and February 2020 by Martin Luther University College and Third Age Learning KW. Thank you for joining us. If you would like more information about Third Age Learning KW and its upcoming lectures, visit the website tal-kw.ca. And for more information on Martin Luther University College and its programs, visit the school's website at luther.wlu.ca.